Hi, my name is Steven, and I'm a product manager at Apple. Today I'd like to show you how to use Podcast Producer to create and capture content. Podcast Producer is a complete end-to-end solution for encoding, publishing, and distributing high-quality podcasts. It's ideal for employee training, university lectures, presentations, or whatever audio and video podcast your organization requires. Podcast Producer simplifies the process of recording content, encoding, and publishing podcasts for playback in iTunes and on iPod, iPhone, and Apple TV. Let's dig right in. First, we're going to launch the podcast capture application from down here in the dock. Before I can use it, I need to log in, so let's type in my password. Now that I'm logged in, I have access to the features of podcast capture. You'll notice that there are 4 different quadrants. The first one is video, where I can record video and audio. The second quadrant over here is audio. This is where I can do an audio-only podcast. Down here in the lower left-hand corner is screen. This we can use to capture screen captures for doing demos or maybe even capturing a keynote presentation along with an audio track. And the last quadrant here is file. Now when I select this, I can actually choose a file for my hard drive that I can submit to the Podcast Producer engine. For this demo, let's go ahead and select video. When I click this the video button, I actually have the option of choosing various video sources. It's default selected, the iSight camera, but if I have remote cameras on my network, I can choose one of those as well. Here you see I've got access to a Yosemite conference room and even a web studio. But for this, let's select the iSight camera as well as the built-in microphone on my system. Once we've chosen those, we simply click the record button and we can start capturing video. For this simple podcast, let's assume that we're creating some sales training materials for a company. I'm going to go ahead and click the record button. Hello everybody, this is the first in a series of podcasts that we're going to be doing to get sales training materials out to the field. You will be receiving an iPod Shuffle in the mail. This iPod Shuffle will contain all the latest sales training materials. To use this, simply plug in your headphones, click the play button, and you will get access to the latest materials. To subscribe, go into iTunes where you will get up-to-date information on all of our sales materials. When I'm done recording, I simply click the Publish button, and I'm brought to this screen where I can choose a few things. The first thing I want to choose is a workflow. Podcast Producer includes 14 workflows. For this one, let's choose Blog and iTunes with intro and effects. And let's give this podcast a title. Let's call this Sales Training Podcast Part 1. And the description will be latest sales training materials. When I click the Done button, my podcast has now been submitted to Podcast Producer. Now let's take a look at how podcast capture can be used to do screen captures. First, we need to launch the podcast capture application from down here in the dock. And we need to add our password in to log into the system. Here we are. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to do a screen capture, so we're going to select the screen icon from here. And in addition to capturing my actions on the screen, Podcast Capture will also do an audio recording. So for this, we're going to select the built-in microphone, and we're going to click the record button. We are now doing a screen recording. I'm going to select the keynote presentation that I have open here. This keynote presentation is for the new Trek Fuel EX. The new Trek Fuel EX is a revolutionary new bike from Trek. It has a brand new redesigned frame with a new rocker link, lower shock mount, and rear pivot. Additionally, it also has an active braking pivot. That's the new Fuel EX bike from Trek. When I'm done with my screen capture, I click the pause button and I click publish to prepare my podcast to be submitted. For this one, I'm going to select the blog and iTunes with watermark workflow. I'm going to title this Fuel EX. And my description will be sales presentation. When I click the Done button, my podcast is now being submitted to Podcast Producer. So you've just seen how podcast capture can be used to capture audio, video, and even record my actions on the screen. And all of this great content is being processed by Podcast Producer for delivery to iTunes, my blog, and much more. Podcast Producer is a complete end-to-end solution for encoding, publishing, and distributing high-quality podcasts. It's ideal for employee training, university lectures, presentations, or whatever audio and video podcasts your organization requires. Podcast Producer simplifies the process of recording content, encoding, and publishing podcasts for playback in iTunes and on iPod, iPhone, and Apple TV. Let me show you how to use the administration tools for Podcast Producer. The two main applications used for administering Podcast Producer are Server Admin and Xgrid Admin. Server Admin is the easy-to-use application included with macOS 10 Server for administering all the services on the server. Here in the dock, I'm going to launch Server Admin. And I'm going to select the Podcast Producer service. First thing we're going to do is start at Settings. Now in the Settings area, I can choose to select my shared file system and my Xgrid controller, and I can also choose to modify any of the metadata components. For that, we're going to select the Properties panel. Here in the Properties panel, I have a variety of metadata items at my disposal. I can choose to modify the mailing list for approval. I can also choose to change the copyright information, and I can even change some of the Quartz Composer effects. Now, included with Podcast Producer are a number of filters and effects that can be applied using Quartz Composer. Here, we have a dissolve, a neon, and a cube, and I can easily change any one of these. For example, I can choose to change this neon one to sepia. I simply do this by deleting the neon and typing in sepia. Clicking the enter button, I have now changed that Quartz Composer effect to sepia. Now, in the workflows area, we can see all of the various workflows that are included with Podcast Producer that can be applied to any of our podcasts that are submitted to Podcast Producer. Now, here inside of Server Admin, we can do a number of things to our workflows. Here we can view the information on any one of these workflows by clicking on the I button. We can modify or add new workflows, and we can actually change the access controls. So as you can see on these particular workflows, they're available for anybody who can log into Podcast Producer, and they can access these particular workflows. But this workflow down here, Submit for Approval, has restricted access. Now what we've done here is we've restricted access to this workflow to a couple of groups and one particular user. The groups are marketing and podcasts, as well as Ursula Peterson. This means that only the folks that are part of those groups, as well as Ursula, actually have access to see and apply this particular workflow to a podcast. Now the last area we want to look at is cameras. So here I'm selecting the cameras. In here you see that we have two cameras available on our Podcast Producer. We have Web Studio and Yosemite. Now these cameras are remote cameras. Now Podcast Capture can capture locally, or it can actually capture a remote camera. Maybe you have a camera set up in a classroom, or you have a camera set up inside of a conference room. By binding a camera to Podcast Producer, anybody who logs into Podcast Capture and who has access to that camera can actually start a recording remotely. So here you can see the Yosemite conference room actually has some access controls applied to it. Lynn Dennis and the podcast group have access to Yosemite conference room camera, but nobody else does. By applying access controls to the cameras, we can restrict the number of people who can access and record podcasts from any particular camera on the network. So that's how you administer Podcast Producer using Server Admin. Now let's take a look at the Xgrid Admin tool. Xgrid is the distributed computing technology built into macOS 10 that allows you to harness the computing power of multiple systems. Xgrid is incredibly scalable. As your encoding needs grow, simply adding additional machines to Xgrid will increase the amount of computing power at your disposal, therefore saving you time. So here we're looking at Xgrid Admin. Now in the first pane, we have the overview. The overview shows you with this nice speedometer the amount of computing power being used on the Xgrid network. You can also see how many jobs are running and how many available processors we have for doing encoding. Next, we have the agents. In the Agents tab, you can see which nodes on the Xgrid network are available to take jobs and which nodes are currently working on jobs. And in the last tab, the Jobs, we can see which jobs have completed, which jobs are still in process, to tell us which files are going to be ready to go and which ones need a little bit more time. So that's Xgrid Admin. So now you've seen how to use Server Admin and Xgrid Admin to administer Podcast Producer. Podcast Producer is a complete end-to-end solution for encoding, publishing, and distributing high-quality podcasts. It's ideal for employee training, university lectures, presentations, or whatever audio and video podcasts your organization requires. Let's take a look at how content created with Podcast Producer is accessed and consumed. the first thing we're going to do is launch the mail application. Podcast Producer can use the built-in mail server in macOS 10 server to notify you that your podcasts have completed. Here you can see we have a beautiful template that has been delivered to our inbox notifying us that the Fuel EX podcast has completed. From within this template, I can click on the link to look at my podcast as it was automatically published to my blog. So here the Safari Mail web browser has launched. And I can see that my Fuel EX screen capture that I recorded earlier today has been automatically published right to my blog. By clicking on the poster frame, we can start and actually take a look at this video. This is a sales presentation for the new Fuel EX bike from Trek. The new Fuel EX bike from Trek has a revolutionary new frame with a redesigned rocker link, lower shock mount, and rear pivot. Additionally, the new Fuel EX has an active braking pivot. So that's the new Fuel EX from Trek. You may have also noticed that in addition to the keynote presentation, there was an intro video as well as some information on the title slide. That was all added as a workflow in podcast capture, as well as some simple metadata that I applied to the file. Now, in addition to viewing this file on my blog, I can also subscribe to it in iTunes. So let's go back to our mail application and let's click on the iPod video link. This will launch the iTunes application as well as subscribe me to this feed. So as you can see here, if I open the disclosure triangle, I have my Fuel EX podcast right here in iTunes, and double-clicking it, I can view this podcast right inside of iTunes. So by subscribing to podcasts in iTunes, you can stay up to date on all the latest content. When new episodes are made available, they get automatically downloaded to iTunes, where they can easily be synced to iPod, iPhone, and Apple TV. But it's not just about blogs and iTunes. In fact, Podcast Producer can be used to create content in many formats and deliver in a wide variety of ways. For more information, go to apple.com/business.